Is American pastor Andrew Brunson coming home? Over the weekend, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said he's hopeful Turkey's government will allow Pastor Brunson to return to the United States in the coming days. The 50-year-old you see there on the screen, he's a native of North Carolina. He was arrested back in December 2016, claiming that he was a spy and had connections to a terrorist group. Brunson was recently released into house arrest, but the charges he's facing mean he could spend the rest of his life in prison if convicted. Joining me to discuss Pastor Brunson's case is a distinguished panel of CBN experts, all of whom have covered this story from multiple angles. First, we start with Ben Kennedy. He is our White House correspondent, joins us at the North Lawn. Jennifer Wishon is CBN senior Washington correspondent. John Wagi is our senior editor, who is currently in Jerusalem. And here in studio with me is CBN senior international correspondent Gary Lane. Thank you all for your time. Jennifer, let me begin with you. Can you briefly tell us who exactly is Andrew Brunson and why was he arrested in the first place?
Sure, George. Well, Andrew Brunson is a pastor from North Carolina who has pastored a church in Turkey for 23 years, peacefully and without incident. 2 years ago, you may remember, there was a coup attempt against Turkish President Recep Erdogan. After that attempted coup attempt, Erdogan became very paranoid. He cracked down on anyone he saw as a threat. He literally arrested hundreds of thousands of academics, of civil servants, of political dissidents. And Christians who are a religious minority in Turkey got swept up in that. And so Andrew Brunson around that time was summoned to his local police department. Again, he had lived in this community for more than 20 years. He was summoned to show his papers, and he thought that at best his visa would be renewed, and at worst he would be deported, as other Christians had been. However, Andrew Brunson was detained, and he was put into an overcrowded prison cell where no one spoke English. There were no other Christians. He was often sent to solitary confinement. He was not allowed to leave his prison cell, and he remained in that state for 18 months before Turkey filed any charges against him. And when they did, it came in the form of a 62-page indictment where he was charged with preaching the gospel in Turkey. He was charged with planning the coup against Erdogan years before it ever happened. And he was charged with being a part of a terrorist organization, many terrorist organizations, in fact, among other things. And so since that time, he's had several court hearings and recently was placed under house arrest, which was an improvement. But now folks who are following his case are concerned that he may not be safe under house arrest because he has been so smeared in the Turkish press that many people in Turkey don't like him and see him as an enemy of the state. And that's where we are today, George.
Yeah, excellent analysis and overview of the situation. Let me go to Ben at the White House. This issue really came to prominence in a greater light when President Trump came into office, and in the last 6-7 months has really honed in on the case of Mr. Brunson. Ben, tell us why Pastor Brunson's case is so important to President Trump.
Well, yeah, George, you're right. For one, President Trump cares for evangelical Christians. He listens to them, and they have really been on the front lines fighting for Pastor Brunson's release. So evangelical Christians are in his ear. We've seen Trump tweet about it, calling Brunson an innocent man of faith who should be released immediately. Trump added that the missionary pastor is suffering greatly, and we continue to hear those stories come out of Turkey. Brunson has lived in Turkey for more than 2 decades, as Jennifer was talking about. He is not a threat, and in the 23 years, he has not committed any crime. So this is a man who wants to share the word of God and bring people to the church. Another reason Trump cares is Vice President Mike Pence, who himself is also a devout Christian who is advocating for Pastor Brunson's release and other Americans detained in foreign countries to also be released. So it appears Pastor Brunson has a lot of allies right here behind me at the White House. George?
And remember, Ben, you put this in the context of when the president gave one of his first interviews coming on the scene, taking over the White House. He spoke to our very own David Brody and mentioned that in his administration, religious freedom and the plight of Christians around the world will take a more prominent role than it has ever been. So you look at his focus on Pastor Brunson in the context of his own view of how Christians around the world have suffered, right? And this administration is keenly aware. Just in the last few days, they've had significant gatherings on the issue of religious freedom and the plight of those who suffer for their faith around the world, right, Ben?
Oh, George, absolutely, no doubt. We've seen President Trump turn to his faith time and time again. And when world leaders are here behind me meeting with President Trump in the Oval Office or somewhere on the White House grounds, he brings up religion. That has been several of the questions posed to President Trump when these dignitaries, when world leaders stop in for a discussion with the commander-in-chief. And he said, yes, I did bring up religious liberty, religious freedom. And he did bring that up with several countries, including North Korea, the big summit that happened several months ago. As you are well aware, George, North Korea is one of the, if not the worst place to be a Christian. There literally is no religious liberty or freedom, and President Trump continues time and time again, we see through this administration, to put that at the forefront when talking with these world leaders.
Yeah. John, let me go to you in Jerusalem, sir. This case took on a dramatic turn, as you know, last week when the White House suddenly decided to slap sanctions on two very high-ranking Turkish officials accused of arresting Pastor Brunson. That's highly unprecedented, right?
Right. You don't have much precedent for that, but then you don't have much precedent for a president like Trump. He comes into it a very short part of his career has been as a politician. And he is seeing things through a different set of lenses. And so we're going to get a different set of actions from the White House from time to time, and this is one of those times. The two high-ranking officials that he placed sanctions on, that's largely symbolic, but it's still a significant thing. The Interior Minister and the Justice Minister. Interior Minister would be like our Department of Homeland Security. These are two guys that by and large, represent the budding police state, really, that Erdogan is building in Turkey, and to the shock of people who value democracy and respect Turkey's tradition of secularism. Of course, that's been changing over the last 14 years or so. But yes, it is different. And George, this isn't the end of the possibilities for what President Trump could do with the enormous economic clout of the United States. There are other things he can do to the Turkish industrialists and people who back the bankers who back Erdogan's moves that he's been making lately. This is just kind of a toe stepping in the water right now. There could be more, and I think that's part of Trump's total dedication to saying we're serious about this Brunson matter.
Yeah, to Gary here in the studio. Gary, back in 2008, the US dollar was equivalent to 1 lira, which is the Turkish currency. Today, $1 basically purchases you about 5 lira on the market. It has plummeted, lost its value. Clearly, this issue, along with all of our various long-standing issues with Turkey, is making an economic dent on the country.
Well, I think it is, George. Many times the markets react to what may come, not what has just happened. And if we do not see Brunson released, we're likely to see more sanctions, maybe sanctions against Turkey itself, a NATO ally. And you and I, George, were talking earlier about this before this program. That Erdogan will respond because he wants to be a member of the European Union. He hasn't given up on that dream. I think it's less likely today than it was maybe several years ago, but he still wants to be a part of the EU. Trump knows that. The European Union knows that, and therefore they know that he will bow to pressure. But he needs to save some face here. Yeah. So some type of deal will have to be worked out where Erdogan can save face and not seem like he's kowtowing to the Westerners.
Jennifer, let me go to you. You know, this is a case that is playing out in a country that is increasingly hostile to Christians and increasingly becoming more Islamic. Erdogan, since he came into power, my understanding is that he has built over 20,000 mosques all across Turkey. Clearly, the plight of Christians, minority group in the country, they continue to suffer, right?
Absolutely. And this is something that, I mean, especially, we keep saying this is a NATO ally, especially with a NATO ally, this is something that U.S. officials are watching very closely because the U.S. has a prerogative to promote religious freedom. And actually today, just hours ago, I interviewed the vice chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, who attended Pastor Brunson's last hearing in July, and she painted an extraordinary scene for me. She said that his court hearing was in a gymnasium attached to the prison in a huge room. And at the front, there was an elevated dais where 3 judges sat, looking down physically on Brunson when he was brought in. And behind Brunson, there were, she said, at least 500 chairs between him and where international observers like herself and Pastor Brunson's wife were allowed to sit and watch. And so she said that as any time Pastor Brunson would turn around, his wife knows that he can't see distances very well. So she would stand up out of her seat and put her hand over her heart so that her husband would know that she was there and supporting him. And you mentioned this move by Erdogan to create a more Islamic state in Turkey. But interestingly, Pastor Brunson used that court hearing to witness to the people who were in the room to share his Christian faith. Let's listen to her description of what he had to say.
Pastor Brunson sat there while he heard former church members, people probably that he baptized, people that he had tea with, testify against him. For 2 hours, he heard his former friends testify against him of what could be a life sentence for him. And the judge at one point turned to him around noontime and asked Andrew Brunson to speak for himself. And he said, "My faith teaches me to forgive. So I forgive those who just testified against me." There was a chill in the room.
Wow.
Yeah. So she said that at that moment, everyone in the room realized that even though these former church members had been testifying against him, really with bogus charges, unsubstantiated, that everyone in the room knew that his faith is real, that when he says he believes in Jesus Christ, that Jesus is his Savior, that is real. And it was just such a powerful, moving experience.
Yeah. Unfortunately, Jennifer, we have a situation where the Turkish government continues to paint Mr. Brunson as a spy. I think, Ms. Director, we've got 2 images of recent newspapers. The Takvim is actually owned by Erdogan's family, and right in there they paint Pastor Brunson. The Aksam is also another newspaper owned by the Erdogan family. They paint Mr. Brunson as a CIA spy, a priest who is actually a spy. Gary, let me go to you. Christians are continuing to suffer in this country. There was a recent program on a national TV network owned by Erdogan's family that basically said that evangelical Christians are a national threat to the country and a global threat around the world.
Georgia, I think that is something new, a new development saying that evangelicals are a threat to not only Turkey but the world. But let's look back, because many people will say, oh, things are getting bad in Turkey for Christians. It's always been bad for Christians in Turkey. Let's not forget 1915, the Armenian genocide. In 1923, when Kemal Ataturk came to power, everyone thought, oh, he's implementing more of a secular society. But he also took steps to make Christians more of a minority and to seize Christian property. Now that got worse. Of course, George, in 2002, when the AKP party came to power, the Justice and Development Party, that's Erdogan's party, and progressively since then, we've seen things get worse. Just about a year and a half, 2 years ago, church property was confiscated in Diyarbakir against the Chaldeans and then also against the Armenian Christians there. And Christians have tried to get their property, their church property, back from this government. The government has refused to give back back property of the Christian property. And, you know, if Erdogan wants to become a member of the European Union, he's going to have to let go of that church property and stop persecuting Christians.
Ben, let me go to you at the White House. Okay, so the sanctions are put in place. What next? I mean, as John mentioned, these are symbolic in large part. First time that the United States has levied sanctions against a fellow NATO nation. What's next from your perspective there at the White House?
Well, yeah, George, you're right. The sanctions are step one, a move designed to put the Turks on notice that the clock had essentially run out. Turkey's president is now talking about retaliatory sanctions. Gary mentioned that earlier against the U.S. Now, no doubt this move is not going to help the situation or speed up Brunson's release. You have to remember the U.S. and Turkey are NATO allies. I expect talks to continue between the Trump administration and Turkey. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, as you remember, just sat down with Turkey's foreign minister in Singapore, where the talks were said to be constructive and that this issue is straightforward, adding that we are going to find a way to bring him home soon. So that is definitely good news. But at the end of the day, Pastor Brunson has not been released. So I don't expect President Trump to really let up on the gas until that happens, George.
Absolutely. The economic and the political pressure will continue to be exerted on Turkey. In fact, Turkey's president over the weekend said that President Trump's slapping of sanctions on these two cabinet members was disrespectful, in his words, in President Erdogan's words. John Wagi, to you, to Jerusalem. There's a well-known Turkish novelist, Alsi Erdogan, no relation to President Erdogan, who went a step further, talking about the Islamic nature of her country. She warned that her country is sliding into fascism. What are her concerns?
Right, and it was of interest here in Israel because it was published in the Times of Israel, which is one of the leading English language dailies here. It was published just today. And, you know, basically she's saying her country is not Germany of the 1940s, but it is becoming Germany of the 1930s, talking about all the consolidation of power that Hitler was, you know, making in Germany at the time. And she warned that every institution is basically in Turkey headed for the abyss. And, you know, she's experienced some of that firsthand because she was arrested and now is in exile in Frankfurt. And she was arrested during the big sweep during the attempted coup, after the attempted coup in 2016. And a staggering number, 70,000 people were arrested in conjunction with that failed coup attempt. She was a newspaper columnist. She's also an author who's written prize-winning work, and she was swept up in that. And she's going to be tried soon in absentia. But these are the kind of people who have fled Turkey and are very, very dismayed at what they see happening. And she pointed in particular to the justice system, which has been the replacement judges who were ousted in the coup and either jailed or sent away, whatever. Those judges have been replaced by 20-something judges, people in their 20s, who are Erdogan supporters. And so you can imagine what kind of ripple effect that might have on the Turkish justice system in the months and years ahead.
Yeah, in fact, the word is that close to about 40,000 members of Turkey's military, they were also purged in this process. There's a caricature that was recently published in The Economist, and it has an image of Erdogan speaking to his doctor, and he says, "Hello, doctor, it's me, President of Turkey. I have a growing problem." And you see this image of Erdogan with this metal steel grip with thorns. He says, "It's in my hand. It has a habit of grabbing power, squeezing opponents, and threatening free media. But right now, my country is under a lot of stress for a lot of reasons and needs a different touch." So the doctor says, so you want me to surgically remove it? And Erdogan replies, "Actually, I was hoping you would make it bigger." Gary, earlier this year, the Washington Post editorial board said Erdogan was becoming a dictator. and transforming Turkey into a totalitarian prison. He was recently given sweeping constitutional powers that no democratically elected leader in Turkey has ever had. What is Erdogan's long-term political and religious goals?
Well, power, and I think he sees himself as a new sultan, as a new caliphate. He wants to reestablish the Islamic caliphate throughout the Middle East. That was his goal with Syria. He opposed Assad. He wanted to see Bashar Assad deposed. He worked to help support ISIS, buying oil from ISIS. They controlled some oil fields when they had control of much of, or a third of Syria and Iraq. He bought oil from them. Also, people in the Middle East told me that he allowed them, ISIS, access to go across the border back and forth. He wanted to use them to not only oppose Assad, but also the Kurdish people in northern Syria and in parts of Iraq who have long opposed the Turkish government. So he wanted to consolidate his power, use it to branch out and spread a caliphate, George, throughout the Middle East, beginning with Syria. But you know, I've talked to many Arabs in the Middle East, especially in places like Egypt. They said, no, we don't want to have, even though we are Sunni Muslims as well, we do not want to see the Turks restore a caliphate in the Middle East.
Yeah, that is not going to happen. Let me go to Jennifer in our Washington, D.C. bureau. As you know, Jennifer, there is a lot of angst between Turks, Kurds, Arabs, Sunnis, and Shias. But I'm curious, as we wrap this up, does the president's handling of the Brunson case send a message to other countries that if you persecute Christians or violate religious freedom rights, there will be consequences?
Absolutely. I mean, the fact that you have the President of the United States, the Vice President, you have 66 U.S. senators who signed a letter demanding that Pastor Brunson be released. The fact that the U.S. Senate has said, we're not going to give you these F-35 jets that you so desperately want. It does send a strong message. And it's not just the president. U.S. law in recent years has strengthened America's push of religious liberty. But we have to wonder, speaking of Erdogan's endgame, I mean, if you look economically, we know just from what we're going through in our own country that the economy speaks loud and clear. And so Erdogan is backing himself into a corner if he does not soon let Pastor Brunson go. Textiles are really the remaining strong industry left in Turkey. The U.S. is the largest importer of cotton into Turkey. Their largest commodity is hazelnuts. And, George, Americans eat an awful lot of Nutella. Erdogan is really alienating himself on the national stage economically, also with his NATO allies. And if he wants to join the EU, I have a feeling he's going to really need to straighten up and lose that iron fist that you just showed us in the cartoon.
That's right. I never thought in this conversation we would be talking about Andrew Brunson and Nutella, but hence we are. Finally, let me go to Ben because this is obviously in the calculus not just of Ankara or Istanbul. It is also in the calculus of that big, beautiful house that you stand in front of, because they know that the pressure is on. And Secretary Pompeo's comments over the weekend trying to dial down the rhetoric after slapping them with these sanctions, with these two individuals. Clearly, it is in Turkey's interest to get this solved very quickly, right?
Oh, George, you're right. And to piggyback off what Jennifer was just talking about here, the more this make headlines, the better it is for Pastor Brunson to be returned home. The more Trump tweets about it, the more that Secretary Pompeo sits down with his counterpart in Turkey. And this is one of the top things that he plans to discuss among a large array of things. The faster, really, this will happen. I think everyone is confident that, yes, Pastor Brunson will be released. There's no proof of anything that he's been accused of doing. And the when is this going to happen? No doubt the president, vice president, members of Congress, as Jennifer was talking about, want this to happen ASAP. I mean, today would be ideal, but we'll just have to wait and see how fast this progresses. But you're right, the longer this stretches out, the worse this looks for Turkey.
Yeah, okay, terrific. Ben Kennedy at the North Lawn in our nation's capital. Thank you, sir, for your fantastic analysis. To Jennifer Wishon, who covers all things politics as well as Nutella these days. Jennifer, thank you so much for your insights. And to my friend John Wagi, who finds himself in the city of Jerusalem, giving us perspective from the Middle East. Sir, thank you to all of you for coming on the show. Gary, my final question to you, final thoughts. What impact will this have, as I mentioned at the top of the show? Already we have issues with Turkey because of its influence in Iran, in Syria, relations with Russia, growing relations with Russia. What impact do you think this case of Mr. Andrew Brunson will have on U.S.-Turkey relations going forward?
Well, they're not good right now, but look, it's in the long-term strategic interest of the United States to resolve this. We need Turkey. We've got a major air base there that supports our strategic interests in the Middle East. Also, Turkey needs the United States. As Erdogan wants to proceed and become a member of the EU, he needs to make good with the United States, Trump, and with the European Union. So I don't expect this is going to last too much longer, George. It should be resolved soon. I think what is needed, though, is Erdogan needs a way to save face and a way out of this.
Yeah, as somebody who understands the Middle East culture, that is very much a part of it. So we continue to pray for Andrew Brunson, as well as the other Americans who are languishing in Turkey as we speak. Okay, so for the latest from CBN News, whether it's on the issues in Turkey or in our nation's capital, you can go to cbnnews.com. On behalf of Gary Lane, I'm George Thomas. Thank you so much for joining us, and stay tuned always 24/7 to CBN News.